And I am recording. So last week, the last part of our session, of course, we're talking about going through 1 Corinthians 15 and speaking about resurrection. And I stepped aside a little bit from the immediate context of what Paul's talking about in that section of the chapter. And because he's talking more there about the body as far as the nature of the resurrection. But I wanted to raise the question of the identity of the person who is raised from the dead, and basically wanted to make the point that it's the same. So, for example, the Dick who we are talking to now is going to be the same person who is resurrected. It's not going to be some other identity. And so in doing that, we talked about the spirit, soul, and body. And I would like to begin this evening by opening to 1 Thessalonians Chapter 5. So 1 Thessalonians Chapter 5. And verse 23 is a good verse to know and keep in mind on this topic. So verse 23 says, "And the very God of peace sanctify you wholly. And I pray, God, your whole spirit and soul and body be preserved blameless unto the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ." So that verse is a good verse because it has the three parts all in one verse, very clearly named: spirit, soul, and body. And so that's what we are composed of. It's interesting how frequently man, even believers, get things backwards. And so if you haven't already noticed this, pay attention when you hear Christians, including preachers, speaking about this. They will constantly say body, soul, and spirit. So they begin with body. But you see in this verse, it says spirit and soul and body. So it begins with spirit. So again, it's just interesting why would you not say it in the order the Bible says? But again, man just gets everything backwards, even when it's something simple. Last week, after the official study was ended, we had a little discussion with some, and there are some interesting comments and questions from Bonsing and Dominic and RJ, who's Benny's son. And I won't go through all of that, but I do want to turn to Hebrews chapter 4. This is a verse that we looked at last week, but I did not point out something that Dominic later pointed out in Hebrews chapter 4. And Jean Gross, would you read verse 12?
"For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, and of the joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart."
All right, we read this verse last week, and I made the point that this verse speaks about the soul and spirit, and it indicates that the soul and spirit are so similar that it takes something as powerful as the Word of God to clearly be able to divide asunder the soul and the spirit. But Dominic pointed out also then verse 12 goes on to speak of the joints and marrow, and those, of course, are parts of our body. So this verse also mentions the spirit, the soul, and the body. And there are other verses also, but I just wanted to mention that. So last week, we kind of talked about the function of the body, the function of the soul, the function of the spirit. And one of the things, we looked at this one last week also, but just briefly again, Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, and Dick, would you read verse 9?
Okay, Romans 1:9. Paul says, "For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, that without ceasing I make mention of you always in my prayers."
All right, and so again, we read this briefly last week, but I think it's significant that Paul says, whom I serve with my spirit. He doesn't say whom I serve with my body or even whom I serve with my soul, but whom I serve with my spirit. And then turn to Philippians chapter 3. Philippians chapter 3. And Han Hui, would you read verse 3?
Philippians chapter 3, verse 3. For we are the circumcision which worship God in the Spirit, and rejoice in Jesus Christ, and have no confidence in the flesh.
Okay, so Paul says, which worship God in the Spirit and have no confidence in the flesh. So we worship God and we serve God in the Spirit or with the Spirit. And again, man gets it backwards. So many religions, including many Christian denominations, really put a great emphasis on worshiping God with the body. And so you have all the standing and the kneeling and the bowing and the raising hands and on and on. They put a great emphasis on the body. And then also, of course, many put a great emphasis on the soul, and they appeal to the emotions. So the way they sing and the way they pray, even oftentimes the way they preach, they put a great emphasis on the emotions. And they believe when they feel some kind of emotion, they believe that's God or the Holy Spirit speaking to them and moving them and so forth. And also they feel like when they want to communicate with God, they have to be very emotional when they do that. And so that's a misunderstanding of thinking that we connect with God with our soul, but we don't. We connect with God with our spirit. And so there are a lot of things involved with all of this. And so Paul did not serve God with religious rituals or sacraments or ordinances and so forth, but rather with his spirit. And he did not serve God with his emotions. And of course, it's not bad. We all have emotions. Emotions are not necessarily bad. In fact, they can be good. But our emotions are always to be subject to our spirit. And of course, that in many religions and Christian denominations, that doesn't happen. The emotions control, the soul controls them. But again, Paul served and worshiped with his spirit. As I mentioned last week, and we looked at some verses, animals also, God formed the bodies of animals, but he did not breathe the breath of life into them as he did with Adam. They do have the breath of life, so God created that, but he didn't breathe that into them. And we also talked about and saw that animals have a soul. So I've heard people say one of the differences between humans and animals is animals don't have a soul, but they do have a soul. And then I've also heard people say the difference is that animals don't have a spirit, but they do have a spirit. Turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. Ecclesiastes, chapter 3. And some of you who were not on a little bit earlier may not have heard that Dominic they've had a power outage all day there today. So I'm not sure how his connection is, but if you can connect and we can hear you, Dominic, would you read Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 21? Yeah, his connection may, as I said, may not be good. So I will read Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 21. Who knoweth the spirit of man that goeth upward, and the spirit of the beast that goeth downward to the earth? So you see, animals also do have a spirit. They have a body, they have a soul, and they have a spirit. But as we briefly talked about last week, and 1 Corinthians 2 is an excellent chapter on this. Animals don't have the soul of a man, and they don't have the spirit of a man. And therefore, as we see, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, animals cannot understand the things of a man because they don't have the spirit of a man or the soul of a man. And one example of that, people sometimes, in fact, often these days talk about animals as though they're on an equal level with humans. But they're not, of course, in the scriptures. And one way to think about this is that, for example, animals cannot know what it's like to be concerned about the economy. For example, many in America now are worried about inflation. Well, animals are never going to worry about inflation. And they can't worry, animals don't worry about war in a foreign land. They don't know what it's like for the home team to win a game or to get a phone call from a friend. And we could go on and on and on with such examples. So those are all things of a man. You understand all of those examples, and we could give many, many more. But an animal doesn't understand any of those examples because an animal does not have the spirit of a man. Turn to let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And a couple other things I want to talk about before we leave this topic of spirit, soul, and body and our identity in our resurrection body. There are some religions that teach it's sometimes called conditional immortality. And what they say is that the body and the spirit together make a soul. And they would use, for example, we read last week in Genesis where God formed Adam's body from the dust of the earth. And then it says God breathed the breath of life into him. And many say that that breath of life is the spirit. And then after that it says, and Adam became a living soul. And so they say that when you combine the body and the spirit together, that now makes a soul, a living soul. And we looked at verses last week to see that that's not the case. The breath of life is not the spirit, for one thing. And we saw tonight already there's a spirit, a soul, and a body. But those who teach that doctrine, they say when the body dies, then the soul no longer exists. Because to have a soul, you have to have a body combined with the spirit. And so if the body is no longer living, then they say the soul no longer exists. And then those who believe in resurrection say that in the resurrection, that unites the body and the spirit again to once again make a soul. But so I want to mention that that's one of the false doctrines that is out there that's fairly common. But unbelievers, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 8, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8.
We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord.
Okay, so many of those who teach that the body and the spirit together form a soul, and so when the body dies, then the soul no longer exists. And again, they say for believers in the resurrection, the body and spirit are united again. So now again, there's a living soul. But they say that unbelievers are not resurrected. And therefore, there can't be a soul because they don't have a body anymore. And so therefore, they teach that unbelievers simply cease to exist. So they're not tormented in the lake of fire or any such thing. They simply cease to exist because the body is no longer there. But as Joyce just read in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 8, we see that we can exist apart from the body. So again, he says, we are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. So even if the body, if we're absent from, and notice, by the way, the true we is not the body, because in this verse, we're absent from the body, but yet we still exist. And in this verse, we're present with the Lord. And then also turn to John chapter 5. And there's, so again, that doctrine, which again is fairly common, that a soul is made up of a spirit, the spirit and body together. That's a false doctrine. We looked at several verses last week and a few tonight. And in addition to what we just saw in 2 Corinthians 5, another mistake that in that doctrine is saying that unbelievers are not resurrected. So John chapter 5, and Freddie, if you are free to read, would you read John chapter 5, verse 28 and 29?
Okay. John 5:28 and 29. Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, the which all that are in the grave shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation.
So notice clearly in these verses, Christ taught that there is a resurrection for unbelievers. It's a resurrection of damnation, but it's nevertheless a resurrection. So that's another mistake in that doctrine that I mentioned. Now, one more thing regarding the spirit, soul, and body, and that is it's very important to understand what is a biblical definition of death. So from a medical perspective, from man's perspective, they might talk about when the heart stops beating or when there's no more brainwave activity or something, but what is the biblical definition of death? So turn to Genesis chapter 35. Genesis chapter 35, and would Dan or Laura read verse 18?
Sure, Laura, go if you want to.
And it came to pass, as her soul was in departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin.
Okay, so this is speaking about Rachel, and it says, as her soul was in departing, and then in parentheses, for she died. So you clearly can see there that when someone dies, their soul departs. And then also turn to James chapter 2. James chapter 2, and Meg, would you read verse 26?
James, what was the chapter?
James chapter 2 and verse 26.
For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also.
So the body without the spirit is dead. So comparing the two verses we just read, we can see that of the biblical definition of death is when the soul and the spirit depart from the body, then the person is dead. And so, of course, then when we talk about the resurrection, that means so that the soul and the spirit continue to exist when the body dies. They just depart from the body, but they don't cease to exist. And then, of course, in the resurrection, the soul and spirit again have a body, a resurrection body. And so again, my main point in bringing all of this up last week and this evening for a while is again the personal identity of the person, which again is the soul and the spirit. It's not the body. You can cut off part of the body, even the body even can die, and the person still exists, the soul and the spirit. And the same person will exist in the resurrection, clearly with a different body, a much better body, but the same person will exist. Okay, then go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And there's one other thing I want to comment on briefly in verse 37 before we move on to the next verse. And that is in verse 30, 1 Corinthians 15:37 again. Paul says, and that which thou sowest not that body that shall be, but bare grain. It may chance of wheat or of some other grain. So that there are many Christians, many denominations, where they teach and believe that there's no such thing as chance or luck or happenstance. And they claim that God has predestinated every event all through the universe and all through history, and that he is now controlling every event in the world so that everything he predestinated takes place. So they would say, for example, everyone who has joined this study tonight, God predestinated before the foundation of the world that you would be in this study tonight. And anyone who's not here tonight, God predestinated that they would not be here. And God predestinated that you would be wearing the clothing that you're wearing right now, sitting in the chair you're wearing in, and everything. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I'm not exaggerating. That is what they teach it. Every little detail was planned by God before the foundation of the world, and he's now controlling everything to make sure that every little detail is fulfilled as he planned. And so again, so they'd say there's no such thing as luck or chance or happenstance. But notice in verse 37, Paul writes, it may chance of wheat or of some other grain. And so we do in that verse see the word chance in the Bible. And I want to just read quickly a few other verses without a lot of comment and show you that this actually is found a number of times in the Bible. So let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 22. Deuteronomy chapter 22, and Aikun, would you read verse 6?
If a bird's nest chance to be before thee in the way, in any tree, or on the ground, whether they be young ones or eggs, and the dam sitting upon the young or upon the eggs, thou shalt not take the dam with the young.
Right, so notice in verse 6 it says, if a bird's nest chance to be before thee in the way. So it doesn't say if God predetermined that a bird's nest would be in that place at that time, or if God controlled that to make it happen. It says if a bird's nest chance to be before thee. And then Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23, and Benny, would you read verse 10?
Deuteronomy 23, verse 10. If there be among you any man that is not clean by reason of uncleanness that chances him by night, then shall he go abroad out of the camp. He shall not come within the camp.
Okay, so this verse speaks of an uncleanness that chanceth him by night. So it doesn't say that God sent to him by night, but it chanceth him by night. And then 1 Samuel chapter 6. 1 Samuel chapter 6, and would someone at the Hovies read verse 9?
First Samuel 6:9. And see if it goeth up by the way of his own coast to Beth Shemesh, then he hath done us this great evil. But if not, then we shall know that it is not his hand that smote us, it was a chance that happened to us.
All right, so it was a chance that happened to us. And then 2 Samuel chapter 1. 2 Samuel chapter 1, and would Dan or Lisa read verse 6? 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 6.
And the young man that told him said, as I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned upon a spear, and lo, his chariots and horsemen followed hard after him.
All right, so as I happened by chance upon Mount Gilboa. And then Ecclesiastes chapter 9. It's not often that you read twice in the same night from Ecclesiastes, but we're going to do that. Ecclesiastes chapter 9, and Paul, would you read verse 11?
Okay. And I returned and saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favored to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all.
Right, so time and chance happeneth to them all. And then let's go to, let's see here. I actually don't have this reference written down for some reason. Luke chapter 10. Okay, Luke chapter 10, and this is a good one because in this case, it's not that the others aren't, but many churches put such emphasis on what Jesus says, although as though that's more the word of God than other parts of the Bible, which of course is not true. But let's see what Jesus says here in the parable of the Good Samaritan. So Luke chapter 10, and Pakinatan, would you read verse 31? Luke chapter 10, verse 31.
And by chance there came down a certain priest that way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side.
So notice Jesus, now this is Jesus speaking, and he says, and by chance there came down a certain priest that way. So he doesn't say God led the priest to be there at that time or predetermined it or any such thing. He says by chance there came down a certain priest that way. And so in addition to several verses that we've looked at here where you see the word chance, there are other words also. For example, the word hap, H-A-P. And the dictionary definition of the word hap is that which comes suddenly or unexpectedly, chance, fortune, accident. So again, so there's some Christians who say there's no such thing as chance or luck or happenstance or an accident, but that's not what we see in the Bible. And so, for example, in this case, turn to the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. And I think you all know the basic story in the book of Ruth. And I just want to draw your attention to one verse, and that is in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 3. It says, and she went and came and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech. So it says her hap was to light on this part of the field. And of course, if you understand the significance of Ruth meeting up with Boaz, that's a very significant event in the Bible. And that simply says that her hap was to light on that part of the field. It doesn't say that God directed it or predetermined it. And we won't take time, but we can, in addition to the word hap, we also in the Bible find haply, and I don't mean happily like being in good cheer, but H-A-P-L-Y, haply, and happen, and happened, and happeneth, and also the word perhaps. So those words are found several times in the Bible. And if you look up the definition, all of them in the definition will have a connection with chance, or in some cases, they will use the word luck. And then and just a couple more, and then we'll get back to 1 Corinthians. Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11. And Gerald, if you are free to read, would you read verse 13? Mark 11:13.
And seeing a fig tree afar off, having leaves, he came, if haply he might find anything thereon. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not yet.
All right, so it says he came if haply, or it would, the idea there would be if by chance he might find anything thereon. And then one more, and that's in Philemon. Philemon, and Jean Gross, would you read verse 15?
I've lost Philemon. I'm having a mental block.
That's right after Titus.
Oh, I missed it. Sorry. I should know what it is. Okay. What verse?
15.
For perhaps he therefore departed for a season, that thou shouldest receive him forever.
Okay, so it says, for perhaps he therefore departed for a season, that, so on and so forth. And we won't look at any more verses on this topic this evening, but I'll just point out, for example, in this verse, if most Christians today, if they were telling this story here in Philemon, they would say that God led him to depart for a season, or he departed for a season because God led him or predetermined it or something. But even Paul, the apostle, having received revelation, writing by inspiration of God, says in verse 15, for perhaps he therefore departed for a season, that thou shouldest receive him forever. Okay, let's go back to 1 Corinthians 15 then. So since that word chance is found in 1 Corinthians 15:37, I just wanted to highlight that a bit. And it's simply not true in the Bible that God predetermined every event that takes place, and now he's controlling every detail and every event in the world and in the universe. In the Bible, there are things that happen. There are things that take place by chance. All right, then 1 Corinthians chapter 15. And let's start in verse 35 again to refresh ourselves on the context here. So 1 Corinthians 15:35. But some man will say, how are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come? Thou fool, that which thou sowest is not quickened except it die. And that which thou sowest not that body that shall be, in other words, the full-grown plant, but bare grain, the seed. It may chance of wheat or of some other grain. But God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him, and to every seed his own body. So again, last week in the beginning of our time this evening, we considered the issue of personal identity and talked about the spirit, soul, and body. But that's not really the issue in this context in 1 Corinthians 15. The issue in this context concerns the body. So in verse 38, but God giveth it a body as it hath pleased him. So the Greeks, and of course Corinth was in Greece, I think we all learned in our history that they had a great love for the athletic human body. So the early Olympics games, for example, they were nude, the athletes were nude during the events. Just for one example of how they put such emphasis on the human body and love the human body. And so they found the idea of the resurrection of the dead, again, to be absurd. So in verse 35, again, they challenge Paul, how are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come? And so Paul is going to discuss then the nature of the resurrection body. And that seems in the minds of the Corinthians, that'd be a very difficult question to answer, questions they raise in verse 35. In fact, they would think those are unanswerable questions. And so Paul deals with their questions by using, as we just read, the illustration of seeds and then the plants that spring forth from the seeds. And clearly this is again an observation that people all around the world can observe, seeds and plants. And in one sense, it's a very simple thing, a very simple illustration. And for example, Paul says in verse 36, thou fool. So he's making the point. This is such an obvious, simple illustration that you have to be a fool not to see this and understand this. But that doesn't mean that everything here becomes very simple and clear. And the Bible uses all through the Bible from beginning to end, uses many examples from nature in prophecies and doctrinal teaching and so forth, as Paul does here. But we have to be a little careful not to think simply because it's an illustration from nature that therefore is something very simple and clear. So I have read many times and heard many times that Christ spoke in parables to make the truth simple and clear. So even the most simple-minded people could understand these things, because the things he speaks about in the parables many are from nature, or they're common life experiences. So very simple to understand. And so they say that, again, that's why Christ spoke in parables, to make the truth simple. Turn to Matthew chapter 13. And I want to take a little time to step aside and talk specifically about the parables. And my point being that when Paul brings up the seed, the bare grain in 1 Corinthians 15, and then the plant that springs forth, and he ties that in with the resurrection of our body, the point that Paul's making, which is a very specific point, is, I believe, quite simple and clear. But we have to be careful not to start going way beyond what Paul is using that illustration for when we speak about the resurrection of the body. Because, again, these things are not necessarily always so simple and clear. And so those who say that the parables were used to make the truth simple and clear could not be more wrong, as we will see in a moment. And we don't have to accept that common statement again that's repeated over and over and over by preachers and Bible scholars and commentators and so forth, because the disciples specifically asked Christ why he began to speak in parables, and he plainly answers their question. So in Matthew chapter 13, Dick, would you read verse 10?
Okay, Matthew 13:10. And the disciples came and said unto him, Why speakest thou unto them in parables?
All right, so that's the question that we're interested in, the very question that they ask. So clearly, as you look at verse 10, the disciples recognized at this point that Jesus was teaching in a different manner than he had been teaching. He suddenly is now beginning to speak in parables. And Matthew chapter 13 is a major turning point in the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ. So turn back to the book of Numbers, chapter 23. And I want to look at a couple passages back here that might kind of help us to understand when Christ began to speak in parables, what was in the mind of the disciples? Now, obviously, as Dick just read, they asked him, why are you doing this? But what would have been in their mind? And I'd suggest that they would have been quite alarmed by hearing Jesus speak in parables, because they would have been familiar from some passages in the Old Testament of God speaking through parables. And they would certainly know that the Old Testament shows that God spoke to rebellious people in parables. So, for example, Numbers chapter 23, and beginning in verse 5. In the, oops, I'm in the wrong book. You're in the right book. I'm in the wrong book. All right, Numbers chapter 23 and verse 5. And the Lord put a word in Balaam's mouth and said, Return unto Balak, and thus thou shalt speak. And he returned unto him, and lo, he stood by his burnt sacrifice, he and all the princes of Moab. And he took up his parable and said, Balak the Moab hath brought me from Aram out of the mountains of the east, saying, Come, curse me, Jacob, and come defy Israel. So you see here, it's a rebellious people being spoken to, And how does God speak to Balaam here? In a parable. Again, in Numbers chapter 23, Han Hui, would you read verse 18?
Numbers chapter 23, verse 18. And he took up his parable and said, Rise up, Balak, and hearken unto me, thou son of Zippor.
All right, so he took up his parable. And then Numbers chapter 24 and verse 3. And he took up his parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor hath said, and the man whose eyes are open hath said. And then also Numbers chapter 24 and verse 15. And he took up his parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor hath said, and the man whose eyes are open hath said. So here we see in Numbers 23, God speaking in parables, and he's speaking to a rebellious people. So the disciples would have known this passage, and then suddenly they hear Jesus begin to speak in parables. And again, I think that would have caused them some alarm that Jesus was suddenly speaking in parables, and they would want to know what's going on here. Why are you speaking in that way? The same way that God told Balaam to speak to Balak. Okay, you can let's go back to Matthew 13. Let me remind everyone, if you're not speaking, please mute, because we're getting a little noise from somewhere. So as I mentioned, many preachers today, if they were asked the question in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 10, why speakest thou unto them in parables? They would say, again, that Jesus taught in parables to make the truth simple for all to understand. So he was simple, common illustrations that even uneducated, simple people could understand and relate to their own lives. But we will see that's not how Jesus answered their question. So Matthew chapter 13 and verse 11. He answered and said unto them, because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. So Jesus' answer is not at all what we would expect after listening to many preachers today. He does not say that he taught in parables to make the truth simple so that all can understand. And he does not say that he spoke in parables because illustrations are an effective method in teaching. That's also another thing that many say today, that in your teaching or preaching, it's good to use illustrations, because people then will get the point, understand better, and then they'll say that's what Jesus did in the parables. He used illustrations. And he does not say that he was speaking in parables to teach moral lessons. Many also interpret the parables. They say we shouldn't try to interpret every detail in the parables. We should simply understand that there's a moral lesson that Jesus is trying to teach with each parable. So the details don't necessarily matter as long as we get that main point or that moral lesson. But again, that's not what Jesus says. And he doesn't say that he spoke in parables to give good texts for gospel preaching, because that's another thing that many preachers pick out these parables. They don't even understand really what the parable's about, but they somehow make it into a good gospel text to preach the gospel. But none of that is what Jesus says, none of those commonly heard things. Jesus' reason for teaching in parables, as he states beginning in verse 11, is entirely different from all of those things that are often heard today. So first, in verse 11, notice that Jesus makes it clear that he's speaking about two very distinct groups in Israel. So notice in verse 11, he says, it is given unto you, but to them it is not given. So you and them are two very distinct groups. earlier in Matthew, we learn very clearly that John the Baptist and Jesus came to divide the nation. And by the time we come to Matthew 13, that division is in the nation of Israel is very evident. And so Jesus taught in parables to give further understanding to his disciples, but to hide the truth from the leadership in Israel and from the multitudes in Israel. So the question in verse 10, again, they ask in verse 10, why speakest thou unto them in parables? So they don't say, why are you speaking to us disciples in parables, but why are you speaking unto them in parables? And in verse 11, Jesus says, because to them it is not given. So instead of using the parables to make the truth simple for them, Jesus says that the parables were used to hide the truth from them so that they would not understand. Okay, then verse 12 in Matthew 13. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath. So in verse 12, whosoever hath, to him shall be given. That's referring to the disciples. They already had a good bit of understanding by the time we come to Matthew 13, and they're going to be given more understanding, more wisdom, because Jesus is going to privately explain the parables to them. And so again, of the disciples, he says in verse 12, he shall have more abundance, more understanding, more wisdom. And then, but in verse 12, he says, but whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath. And that's referring to the religious leaders and to the multitudes in Israel. They were, the religious leaders and the multitudes in Matthew 13, they are already confused and misunderstanding and not understanding many things. And not only will they not advance in knowledge through the parables, but they are going to grow increasingly confused and ignorant when Jesus speaks to them in parables, because they won't understand and they will misinterpret the parables. Look back in chapter 11 in Matthew for a moment. Matthew chapter 11 and verse 25. At that time, Jesus answered and said, I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. So Jesus thanks God that truth has been revealed unto babes, unto the disciples. But the wise and the prudent, the great esteemed religious leaders and scholars in the nation, Jesus thanks God that he's hiding the truth from them. So when people heard Jesus teach plainly, then what happened? Look back in Matthew chapter 7, and we will close with this verse for tonight, or with these verses. Matthew chapter 7. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus did not speak in parables. He spoke very plainly. And notice the response. Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 28. And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. So that's the response to the Sermon on the Mount. They all clearly understood what Jesus was saying in the Sermon on the Mount, and they were astonished because Jesus spoke so plainly and clearly as one having authority, not in the wishy-washy kind of ways that the scribes spoke. So We all have watched politicians, for example, and religious leaders are also much the same way. When they are asked a difficult or a challenging question, they'll speak in very vague, general, wishy-washy kinds of terms. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus didn't speak like that at all. It was very plain and clear. But again, when he begins to speak with parables, the disciples are alarmed, as we've spoken about, and want to know why he suddenly is making that shift. And as we saw, Jesus tells them that it's not to make the truth simple and clear, but to hide the truth. All right, we will stop there for this evening. So thank you all.
And
Heard
Okay,
all
good
of my
night.
religious life growing up in Southern Baptist churches